here or there, anywhere, found on the internet?
So, a couple things about that. In the audits that I've done, we've found a lot of blog code.
Yeah.
And it always amazes me that we find it because generally, when you're building a fingerprint repository, we have got like 8.5 billion lines of code that we fingerprinted so far, and we constantly find new libraries that we want to scan, and we're scanning them and adding them to our fingerprint database. But, how do you go scan a blog, right? Exactly. And so, and what's the bang for the buck? Because we're pointing our tools out at large repositories and trying to build these massive, databases of fingerprints as quickly as we can. So having those fingerprints are, it's a little bit on the rare side to find them as an exact snippet match. What's more likely, and this is how we find this stuff, is you find it through license scanning, you find it through copyright notices that are most often left in the code. One of my favorite ones is an audit that we're doing right now, where it has copyright, the organization we're doing the audit for, their date. It says, private and proprietary code of this organization. And then there's a few little headers that they put in, and there is a GPL declaration from the code that was pasted in from the developer. Right. Now, if the developer had not pasted it in, and we didn't have the fingerprint for that code, there'd be no license to match, and it would essentially go undetected. But so yeah, we find a lot of that stuff, but there's always a possibility that we miss it.
Yeah. It's a complicated problem. And I think like in license compliance like that, I think is like the biggest growing problem is code snippets that your developers find online and throw in the code. And
right.
You think about the source of that, whether it's licensed, it's not licensed,
right.
And just trying to resolve that, especially if you're shipping the code later.
Right. And I think it's interesting that an organization wouldn't, well, maybe, I wouldn't say never, but it's most likely they're not going to tell every developer on the team, you can go out and license proprietary software and stick it in our code. Here's a credit card. Go grab it and use it. I mean, it seems silly, right? But organizations are tacitly allowing them to go grab code that they didn't write and put it into their code. And there's huge implications, not just from a licensing perspective, right? And so I think what we're doing at these conferences is we're really starting to talk about, how do you manage those processes, right? And how do you kind of get caught up, if you will, right? And these auditing tools are getting really, really good. These auditing services will give you a really good picture of what you have, and it will give you a place to build from going forward. And you can build the processes then, and you put the knowledge into the development organization and the policies into the organization and the procedures that make it easy for them. Because you don't want to stifle innovation, right? And you don't want to stifle them, getting code. We were building a process for an organization in Minnesota, and they had agile development. They get these two-week cycles, and they do their product planning. They sit down, they go, we got to have this feature, and some guy goes, hey, I know some open source that does that, right? And so we're going in trying to develop a policy where they can vet that product, right? Get approval to use it and get it in within 2 weeks, and that seems tough. It seems unreasonable. But then the flip side is years and years of doing no approval, right? And having all of this stuff that is unknown. Okay. So some of the issues, let me jump back to the slides. Thanks for the questions, I appreciate it. So some of the issues with audits is we will find code that doesn't have a license. And I think that's actually what you're talking about, right? Even when you find the code, you go to the blog, the guy says nothing about how it's licensed. So what do you do then? So you have to have an understanding. You have to have a lawyer involved inevitably. And you'll want to understand, how would copyright law, for example, play into the distribution of this product, and make sure that you don't infringe on precedents. Licenses that don't seem to belong to any particular code. This is classic. If you've ever downloaded Geronimo, download it and scan it. They've got a directory called licenses, and they've got a whole bunch of licenses in there. And they've got a great notices file, and it says in the notices file that we use this component in Geronimo, and it's under this license. We use this component under this license. But you can't find those components. So it was true. I believe that it was true when the notices file was written, right? So how do you deal with it? I mean, let's say you scan a whole bunch of code, you don't find any GPL code, but you find a couple of copies of the GPL license in the distribution that you have. It makes you nervous. Licenses included, the license that's included is different from one identified on the project website. That is so common. Go to SourceForge, just go grab 10 different projects and look at the summary page. And the summary page will say license. And it'll say things that don't make any sense. It'll say LGPL, GPL. LGPL, comma, GPL. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there's some code under GPL and some under LGPL? Does it mean you have a choice between LGPL or GPL? You'll download the code and open it up and there'll be a BSD license inside of it. And so that happens all the time. Dual or disjunctive licensing. And so that's the other thing, that's the thing I just mentioned. If an author of some code puts in the header, this is under the GPL and BSD license, did he mean that you could choose? If he says it's or, if he says this is under the Eclipse public license and alternatively you can do it under LGPL, that's much clearer. But you have to make some decisions about the intent of the author. If the author's not available, you can always contact the author. Code that only has copyright notices. Comments in code that have additional terms, and that's what I was talking about from the beginning. It's not really clean. Things aren't just under Apache or just under GPL. People will literally write the terms of usage in the header of the source code. They'll say, you can use this. They'll disclaim warranty. They'll say it's as is. You can't sue me, if it breaks. But then they'll say something like, you can't claim that you wrote this code. And if you modify it, you have to contact me. And those are terms of use. Multiple packages, multiple licenses. This is something we did a couple of years ago. So we downloaded Ant, MySQL connector, AspectJ, and Spring Framework. And this was a few years ago. We scanned it. And there were 7 different jars inside of Ant, 9 in MySQL's connector. AspectJ had 19. This version of Spring Framework had 61 additional open source components in it. So we had 9. What the developer would have told his boss is I'm using Spring AspectJ, MySQL connector, and Ant. And he'd say Spring's under Apache, AspectJ is under Eclipse, MySQL connector is under GPL, and Ant's under Apache. So I've got I've got the Apache license, I've got Eclipse, and I've got GPL. There were 21 licenses that we found within those components. Just a couple of screenshots of our product, and I'd be glad to give you a demo if you're interested in learning a little bit more. So this is what the scanning tool looks in our product. It's a SaaS model, software as a service, so you can we run these scans through a Java Web Start application, downloads a lightweight Java app onto your computer, runs through, creates a series of fingerprints of your code that are then submitted up to the server. Now those fingerprints are just hashes, so none of your code ever leaves your environment. Goes up, we compare it against our massive fingerprint database, and we come back and we say, oh, 74% of the plugins in the plugins directory matched with Apache Geronimo. And some small percentage was matched with Apache Pluto. So we'll give you information about what we found. We'll also list, you see these series of tabs across the top, we'll list the packages that we'll find. So Apache Web Server, BusyBox, CentOS, we'll tell you what licenses they're under. So the product will allow you to build the bill of materials and the bill of licenses. And one of the nice things, and one of the services that we offer, and a lot of this information is actually in just our public offering of OLEX, OpenLogic Exchange. It's just olex.openlogic.com. Is we've analyzed some 750 licenses, I want to say. And in our analysis of open source licenses, we've categorized the obligations and the restrictions for compliance purposes to kind of bring it down to a level that's a little bit more digestible. So if you had the daunting task, well, let's say this developer who brought in AspectJ, MySQL connector, Spring, and Ant, and said, okay, can I use this stuff? And presented to the lawyer 21 licenses, 21 and said, hey, can you read through these 21 licenses and tell me what I have to do to comply? It could be, the lawyer would probably say, yeah, I'll get back to you in about 6-7 months. So what we've done is broken down and categorized these into kind of digestible chunks of obligations. So in the Apache 2.0 license, you have an obligation to distribute a copy of the license. You have to give notice of modified files. You have an obligation to include notice text or files. And for each license, we'll do that. So at the end of the day, you'll see that of those 20 licenses, maybe 18 of them require that you include a copy of the full license text with your distribution, for example. A lot of them will talk about whether or not you have modification requirements. Do you have advertising requirements? Do you have give back to community requirements? Do you have requirements to distribute source code, and under what conditions? And then we'll supply the relevant text. So the lawyer can see at kind of at a high level what is required, right? And they can read the relevant text. So this is it's an aid, if you will, in helping you comply. And then finally, what does an audit report look like? Here's something that we use, a format that we use. We'll list the products, we'll list the licenses. In this particular audit, the customer wanted to know if there were any GPL or LGPL, so we marked those with a highlight. We put in any notes, like with Bean Shell, disjunctive licensing, choose LGPL or Sun public license. For Antler, older versions were public domain, but with Antler 3, everything went under the Antler 3 BSD license. So notes to the customer. And we'll tell you the model. We'll tell you if it's freeware or open source, primarily defined by the OSI. And so I talked about this at the beginning. The elements of the report are the bill of materials, bill of licenses, complete list of requirements for compliance purposes, and then any licenses that may have conflicting terms. How are we doing on time?
Yeah, we're got about a minute.
About a minute, okay, good. So the audit provides the facts and not the legal analysis. And by the way, this slide deck was created by OpenLogic's corporate counsel. So she's putting a plug in for the lawyers. So the limitations of the audit is it's going to tell you what you have, but it's not going to necessarily tell you how to comply. So the next part that's really, really important in the audit, if you're doing the audit yourself or if you're having someone else do it, is to understand how this software is used. Right? You have to understand compliance. Oh, by the way, usage drives compliance. So if you're not distributing, obviously, you have less requirements than if you are distributing. If you're advertising, that may drive additional. You have to understand incompatibility between licenses and remedies. You may have to rewrite code, you may have to remove code, you may have to find alternative code. And then, this is where the legal and the business people are ultimately involved, is ascertaining risk and the level of risk. I was talking with Jim Jagelski last night, and I was asking him, SFLC is really setting a precedence. They on their website, they allow you, if you know of misuse of GPL code, you can contact them so that they can check into it and take action. So they're kind of policing the use of GPL. And I said, well, is the ASF doing anything similar? And short answer, no, we're not. So what is the risk of non-compliance with Apache license, right? It's relatively low, but not an excuse for not doing it. Okay, I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Can I have a couple minutes for questions, or?
Well, we are at about 10:55.
Okay.
So the next session is scheduled to get started at 11 o'clock.
Okay.